The city burned for 3 days, not in a sudden, single blaze, but slowly, the way old wood burns, catching in one quarter, dying down, catching again somewhere else, as though the city itself did not want to admit it was finished. From the ships pulled up along the shore, the men who had spent 10 years trying to bring down those walls could look back and watch the smoke rise in thin, patient columns against a pale Aegean sky. Somewhere in the wreckage, altars that had stood for generations were cold. Somewhere, women who had woken that morning as princesses were being divided like cattle or bronze among the victors. Among the men standing on that shore was a king from a small, rocky island most of his companions had barely heard of before the war, a place with too little farmland and too many goats, a place called Ithaca. His name was Odysseus, and although history would eventually remember him as clever above all things, at this particular moment, he was doing something almost nobody else on that beach thought to do. He was hesitating. Around him, the other Greek commanders were already arguing about departure. 10 years is a long time to be away from a kingdom, a wife, a harvest, a throne that someone else might quietly be sitting on. Every captain on that beach wanted to sail home immediately, before the winter winds turned the sea into something worse than an enemy. But Odysseus, ever the calculator, understood something the others didn't yet, that endings are rarely as clean as they look from the outside. A war does not stop being dangerous the moment the fighting stops. It simply changes what kind of danger it offers. He was right to hesitate. He simply didn't yet know why. To understand what happened to Odysseus over the following 10 years, it helps to understand what kind of world he was leaving and what kind of man the war had made him into. The Bronze Age Aegean was a world stitched together by water. Look at a map of it, and you will notice something immediately. There is almost no way to get anywhere without a ship. Small kingdoms clustered along coastlines and on islands, each one really a fortified household writ large. A palace, a harbor, fields worked by farmers who owed loyalty and grain to whichever king controlled the strongest walls. There was no unified Greece in the way we might imagine it today. No single language of law, no single currency, no single army. There were alliances, marriages, debts of honor, and threats. Troy had been destroyed not because of some abstract national conflict, but because of exactly this kind of personal, tangled obligation, a broken marriage, a stolen queen, and a network of kings who had once sworn an oath to defend whoever her husband turned out to be. Odysseus had not wanted to go to war in the first place, according to the tradition that later poets and storytellers preserved. When the call came to honor that old oath, he tried to avoid it, pretending madness, yoking an ox and a donkey together to plow a field and sowing it with salt instead of seed, hoping to be judged unfit to fight. It didn't work. A visitor placed his infant son, Telemachus, directly in the plow's path, and Odysseus swerved to avoid him, proving his sanity beyond doubt. There was no way out after that. A man who will not let his own child come to harm cannot convincingly claim to have lost his mind. It is worth pausing on that detail because it tells us something about who Odysseus was before the war ever touched him. A man capable of extraordinary invention, but not, in the end, a man who could out-invent his own love for his family. That tension between cleverness and connection would define almost everything that happened to him afterward. He went to Troy. He fought there for 10 years, and by every account that survives, he became, over that decade, something the war itself had shaped him into. Not simply a soldier, but a strategist, a man whose reputation rested less on his spear than on his mind. It was Odysseus, tradition holds, who devised the trick that finally broke the 10-year stalemate. A massive wooden horse offered as a false gift, hollow enough to hide armed men inside it, convincing enough that a city exhausted by a decade of siege chose to believe the war was over and drag the thing inside its own walls. The horse worked. Troy fell in a single night after resisting for 10 years, and there, on that beach afterward, watching the smoke rise, Odysseus should have felt triumphant. He did not, entirely, because cleverness that wins a war does not always know how to stop. The sack of a Bronze Age city was not a tidy event. Temples that had stood as neutral ground even during the fighting were no longer respected once the walls came down. It is here, in the specific details of how Troy fell, that we find the true beginning of Odysseus's 10-year journey, not in a storm, not in a monster, but in a set of choices made by desperate, victorious, undisciplined men in the hours after a war finally ended. Among the horrors of that final night, one act in particular would matter more than any other to the story that followed. The killing of a Trojan priest at the altar of the god Poseidon, and, in some versions of the tradition, an assault upon Poseidon's own temple during the chaos of the sack. Historians and scholars of myth disagree about precisely which act, or whose act, most offended the sea god. The ancient sources themselves are not perfectly consistent on this point, and it is honest to say so, rather than pretend certainty where the tradition offers none. What the different versions agree on is the outcome. Somewhere in the desecration of that final night, the god who ruled every wave and current the Greek ships would need to cross took offense. And crucially, this is the detail worth holding on to. Odysseus was not the one who committed the offense. That was another Greek commander, a man named Ajax the Lesser, whose violence against a Trojan priestess in Athena's own temple during the sack drew the fury of that goddess as well. But the gods of this world did not always aim their anger with surgical precision. Divine wrath, in the world Homer's audience understood, tended to fall across entire fleets, entire expeditions, entire generations, punishing the group for the sins of the few, because the group had stood by and let it happen or failed to make it right afterward. Odysseus did not yet know that a grudge was forming against the Greek ships in general, and that his own name, in particular, would soon become tangled inextricably with it. That thread would not become fully visible until later, until a cave and a giant, and a boast made in a moment of pride. But the seed of it was planted here, on this smoking beach, in the hours when a war that should have ended in relief instead ended in something closer to guilt. The Greek fleet did not depart as one. This, too, matters. Agamemnon, the high king who had led the expedition, wanted to make sacrifices and appease the gods properly before sailing. A cautious, correct instinct, for once. His brother Menelaus, eager simply to reclaim his wife Helen and go home, wanted to leave immediately. The commanders quarreled, openly, on the beach, in front of their exhausted men. It is a strange thing to imagine. An army that had spent 10 years perfectly unified by a single purpose, dissolving into fragments in a matter of days once that purpose was achieved. But this, too, is something history teaches again and again. Shared struggle creates unity that shared victory often cannot sustain. Odysseus's own ships eventually sailed, 12 of them according to tradition, a modest fleet for a modest kingdom filled with men who had survived 10 years of siege warfare and now wanted nothing more than the sight of their own shores, their own families, their own harvests coming in. They were confident. Why wouldn't they be? They had endured the worst war of their generation and lived. Ithaca was not far. As these things were measured, a journey of days, not years, under ordinary circumstances. Nothing about what followed would be ordinary. As the ships pulled away from the smoking ruin of Troy, Odysseus stood at the stern of his own vessel and watched the coastline recede, not with triumph exactly, but with something quieter. Call it the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent a decade solving other people's problems and now, finally, believes he is free to solve his own. He had a wife on Ithaca he had not seen in 10 years, a son who had been an infant in a plow's path and would now be a young man he would not recognize, a throne that other men, perhaps, had begun to eye with interest during his long absence. He believed he was sailing toward all of that. He had no way of knowing that the sea itself had turned against him, that a god's patience does not run on a human calendar, and that the short voyage home he expected would instead become 10 more years of exile, longer than the war itself, carrying him past monsters, witches, the edge of the underworld, and the ruin of every single man who had sailed with him out of that harbor. The wind filled the sails. The coast of Troy shrank behind them into smoke and memory, and somewhere far beneath the water, something enormous had already begun to take notice. While Odysseus's ships pulled away from the smoke of Troy, on Ithaca, a boy who could barely remember his father's face was learning to hate the sound of laughter in his own house. It is worth pausing here, because the story of Odysseus is often told as though it belongs entirely to the sea, to monsters and storms and distant islands. But half of it, quietly, belongs to a house, and a house can be its own kind of dangerous place. 10 years is long enough for an infant to become a young man. Telemachus had been a baby, too young to remember the plow, too young to remember the father who had swerved to save his life before leaving for a war that was supposed to last a season. He grew up on Ithaca, surrounded by a story rather than a person, a father who existed mostly as an absence, a name invoked at feasts, a shadow his mother carried without ever quite setting down. And by the time our story properly begins, roughly 10 years after the fall of Troy, that absence had curdled into something much more dangerous than grief. It had become opportunity for other men. Consider what it meant in that world for a king to simply vanish. A Bronze Age kingdom was not an abstract institution that ran itself. It was a household, expanded outward, a king's authority resting on his presence, his relationships, his ability to host, to judge disputes, to lead men in war and peace alike. Remove the king, and you do not simply create a vacancy. You create a wound that ambitious men will inevitably try to widen. For years after the war ended, word trickled back to Ithaca of other Greek commanders returning home. Some triumphant, some disastrous, some murdered the moment they stepped off their ships, by wives who had taken lovers during the long absence. But no word came of Odysseus. No wreck was reported, no sighting, no confirmed grave. He was neither certainly alive nor certainly dead. And it was precisely that uncertainty, that unclosed door, which the men circling Penelope had learned to exploit. They called themselves suitors. In reality, they were something closer to an occupying force that had simply never been asked to leave. More than 100 of them, by the traditional count, young noblemen from Ithaca and the surrounding islands, all claiming to court the queen, all camped in Odysseus's own hall, eating his cattle, drinking his wine, sleeping with his serving women, and waiting, with varying degrees of patience, for Penelope to either choose one of them as a new husband or simply be worn down into submission. Every day the king did not return. Their claim strengthened. Every feast they held at his expense diminished. A little more, the kingdom Telemachus would one day inherit, if there was anything left of it to inherit at all. Notice what has changed here. In Troy, Odysseus fought an enemy he could see on a battlefield with clear rules. On Ithaca, his family was under a different kind of siege entirely, one with no walls to defend, fought through patience, hunger, and humiliation rather than spears. Telemachus, at the edge of manhood, was old enough to be furious and too young or too uncertain to know what to do with that fury. He was, by most accounts, a thoughtful young man, careful, a little withdrawn, aware that he was being watched and measured by the very men eating his father's cattle in his father's hall. What did he want? Simply this: to matter, to be treated as something other than a child in his own house, a placeholder king waiting for a father who might never come. What did he fear? That his father truly was dead, and that admitting it would mean surrendering his mother, his home, and his birthright to whichever suitor proved most ruthless. What did he lack? Authority, allies, certainty, a plan. It is a particular kind of cruelty, being the son of a famous man who disappeared, inheriting a legend's expectations without any of a legend's power. One evening, disguised as an old family friend, a traveler named Mentes, a visitor arrived at the hall and found Telemachus sitting apart from the feasting suitors, watching them consume his inheritance, with an expression somewhere between grief and rage. The visitor was, in truth, Athena. Here it is worth stepping back for a moment to understand the shape of the divine world this story takes place in, because it will matter again and again as the narrative unfolds. The gods of this tradition were not distant, abstract forces. They were active participants, quarrelsome, protective, vindictive, occasionally petty, occasionally generous, who took personal interest in the fates of particular mortals, often for reasons that had more to do with old grudges and old favors than with any larger cosmic justice. Athena, goddess of strategic wisdom, had favored Odysseus since the war itself, drawn to him precisely because his gifts mirrored her own. Not brute strength, but cunning, patience, the ability to see 3 moves ahead. Poseidon, as we have already begun to see, had turned against him, and for years, in the divine councils on Olympus, the 2 influences had been roughly held in balance. Athena unable to fully protect her favorite, while Poseidon's anger simmered unaddressed. That balance, as we will see in the next act, was about to shift. But its first quiet effect appeared not on the sea at all, but in that hall on Ithaca, in the shape of a stranger who sat down beside a discouraged young man and began, gently, to change the direction of his life. Disguised as Mentes, Athena did not announce herself as a goddess, did not promise miracles. She did something quieter, and in its way, more difficult. She suggested that Telemachus stop waiting. She told him his father was not dead, that some god was likely holding him, somewhere still, alive, delayed rather than destroyed. And more importantly, she told him something no one else in his life had been willing to say plainly, that he was no longer a child, and that a man who wants his house back does not sit in it, watching it be devoured. Go and ask, she told him. Sail to the old warriors who fought beside your father, Nestor at Pylos, Menelaus at Sparta, men who might have heard some rumor, some fragment, some sighting on their own long roads home, and while you are gone, call an assembly, speak in front of the suitors publicly, demand, in front of witnesses, that they leave your house. It was not a plan guaranteed to succeed, but it was, crucially, a plan. The first thing resembling agency Telemachus had been offered in 10 years of watching and waiting. The assembly he called the next morning did not go well, in the sense that the suitors were neither shamed nor moved by it. Antinous, the sharpest and most arrogant among them, mocked the boy openly, suggesting his mother was the one truly responsible for their prolonged stay, that Penelope herself had strung them along. And this, in fact, was true, in a way none of them yet fully understood. For 3 years, Penelope had held off remarriage using a single, elegant piece of deception, one that deserves to be understood not as a footnote, but as a demonstration that cunning, in this story, was never a trait that belonged to Odysseus alone. She had announced that she could not consider remarriage until she finished weaving a burial shroud for her father-in-law, the aged Laertes, a task any suitor would have to respect, since neglecting the proper funeral rites of an elder was a serious social and religious failure in that world. Each day, she wove visibly at her loom in the hall, in front of everyone. Each night, once the hall was quiet, she secretly unpicked the threads she had woven that day, undoing her own progress so the shroud would never near completion. It worked for 3 years, an extraordinary length of time to maintain a single deception in a household full of suspicious, greedy men watching her every move. It was eventually a disloyal servant who betrayed the trick, catching her unweaving the cloth by torchlight and reporting it to the suitors. By the time our story properly opens, the ruse had been exposed, and Penelope had run out of ways to stall. Hold that detail in mind. The loom, the patient unweaving, the willingness to labor for years at a task designed only to buy time, rather than to finish anything. It is not simply a clever trick. It is, in miniature, the entire shape of what Penelope's life had become. Endless, exhausting labor invested not in building something new, but in holding a door open for a man who might never walk back through it. Telemachus sailed from Ithaca not long after the failed assembly, slipping away secretly at night so the suitors, who had begun plotting to murder him on his return, seeing him as an inconvenient obstacle rather than a harmless boy, would not know he had gone. He left behind a mother who did not yet know where he had gone, a house still full of men eating through what remained of his inheritance, and a kingdom drifting without anyone firmly holding its rudder. But he left, notably, no longer entirely a boy. Something in that conversation with the disguised goddess, in simply being told by someone that his anger was justified and that action was possible, had begun to change him. It would be a slow transformation, tested over the following acts by disappointment, by grief, by the discovery that even the men his father had fought beside might have little real help to offer him. But it had begun. Far across the sea, on a different island entirely, his father was undergoing a transformation of his own, though not, as we will soon discover, the kind either of them would have chosen. To understand why Telemachus's small act of courage on Ithaca mattered at all, we have to climb for a moment away from the sea and the smoke-stained halls of mortal kings, up to the place where the story's true machinery operated, the assembly of the gods on Olympus. It is easy, reading a story like this one from a great distance of time, to treat the gods as decoration, colorful figures who occasionally intervene to move the plot along. But to the audiences who first heard this story, told aloud, night after night, the gods were the explanation for everything that could not otherwise be explained. Why does one ship sink and another survive an identical storm? Why does one clever man succeed and another, equally clever, fail? The answer in this world was rarely chance. It was attention, whether some god happened to be watching, and whether that god's mood, that day, tilted toward favor or fury. And so, before we return to Odysseus himself, we need to understand the argument that was quietly shaping his fate from above. The scene, as later poets described it, opens with Zeus, king of the gods, reflecting almost wearily on how often mortals blamed the gods for suffering that was, in his view, substantially their own doing. He gives as his example a mortal king named Odysseus, who had recently been destroyed for his own crimes, despite every divine warning against them. It is a small aside, but a telling one. This story, even in its opening theological throat-clearing, insists that mortal choices carry real weight, that fate and divine will do not erase human responsibility. Odysseus's own trials, we will see again and again, are not simply things that happen to him. They are frequently the direct consequence of choices he makes, sometimes wise, sometimes reckless, layered on top of a divine grudge he did not personally create, but must nonetheless survive. Into this reflection, Athena speaks. She does not plead abstractly for justice. She is precise, strategic, faintly exasperated, much like the hero she favors. She points out that Odysseus, alone among all the surviving Greek commanders, remains trapped and suffering, held now for years on a remote island by the nymph Calypso, who wishes to keep him as an unwilling husband and has offered him immortality itself in exchange for staying. Meanwhile, she notes, his own household on Ithaca is being devoured, his wife harassed, his son in danger. And this is where the story becomes interesting, because Zeus's response reveals something crucial about how this divine drama actually works. He does not command Poseidon to relent. He cannot, not directly. Even the king of the gods respects the specific domains and grievances of the other Olympians, and Poseidon's fury over the blinding of his son is understood by all the gods to be, in its own terms, entirely justified? What Zeus can do, and does, is act while Poseidon is elsewhere, away, according to tradition, visiting a distant people called the Ethiopians, far from Olympus and crucially, temporarily unable to object. It is worth sitting with this detail because it tells us something about the peculiar mechanics of fate in this story. Odysseus' suffering is not going to be erased by some grand reversal of divine justice. It is going to be managed, worked around, advanced in careful increments during the windows when his enemy's attention happens to be elsewhere. His freedom, when it finally comes, will not feel like triumph handed down from above. It will feel, as we'll see, like something narrowly, precariously won. Zeus agrees to send the messenger, god Hermes, to Calypso's island, instructing her to release Odysseus, not because his suffering has become unbearable to watch exactly, but because it is time, in the calculus of fate, for the story to move forward, and Athena, satisfied with this small victory, turns her attention immediately to the other half of the problem. The boy on Ithaca, whom we have just watched her visit in disguise. Notice the structure of what has just happened, because it will repeat itself in different forms throughout the story. A god intervenes not with overwhelming force, but with a nudge, a suggestion, a disguise, a single conversation that opens a door a mortal must then choose to walk through. Athena does not sail to Pylos and Sparta on Telemachus's behalf. She simply tells him to go, and steps back to see what he does with the telling. This matters for how we should understand Odysseus's entire journey, which is coming. He will receive divine help repeatedly, from Athena above all. But that help will almost never take the form of rescue. It will take the form of information, disguise, timing, and occasionally a very narrow escape from consequences that his own choices set in motion. The gods in this story do not carry their favorites home. They walk beside them, sometimes invisibly, and let them do the difficult work of surviving themselves. Why does this matter? Because it is the difference between a story about luck and a story about character. If Odysseus were simply protected by an all-powerful goddess who solved his problems for him, there would be little reason to care what kind of man he was. Instead, we are being shown carefully from the very beginning that this is a story about what a particular kind of intelligence, patient, adaptable, occasionally arrogant, can and cannot survive even with a god's quiet favor. There is a second thread worth pulling from this council scene, one that will not fully pay off until much later in the story. The question of what, exactly, Odysseus is being brought home to. Even as Athena argues for his release, she does not pretend that homecoming will be simple. Ithaca is not waiting for him peacefully. It is a kingdom being consumed from within, a household under siege by over 100 armed young men who have, by this point, begun actively plotting his son's murder. Zeus's decision to send Odysseus home is not, in other words, a decision to send him toward safety. It is a decision to send him from one kind of danger directly into another, trading monsters and storms for something arguably more dangerous still, because this time the enemy will not be a giant or a witch, easily identified as inhuman and other. It will be his own neighbors, men he may have once shared a table with, entrenched inside his own hall. Keep that in mind as the adventures unfold in the acts ahead. The Cyclops, the winds, the witch, the descent to the dead, It can be tempting, hearing these episodes told one after another, to think of them as the substance of the story, and Ithaca as merely its backdrop, the reward waiting at the end. But the Council of the Gods quietly establishes the opposite priority. The sea voyage is the delay. Ithaca, and the reckoning waiting there, was the story all along. The council concludes, Hermes is dispatched toward Calypso's distant island, carrying instructions that will end 7 years of captivity for a man who, at this exact moment, is sitting on a beach he has come to hate, staring out at a sea that has taken everything from him and given nothing back. We will return to him shortly, and to that island, and to the strange, complicated grief of a man offered immortality who wants nothing more than to grow old, ordinarily in a small stony kingdom that may not even remember his face. But first, because a story like this does not proceed neatly in a single line, any more than a life does, we need to go back further than the council, further than Ithaca, back to the beginning of the voyage itself, back to the moment the 12 ships first pulled away from the smoke of Troy, sailing confidently toward a home that was still, at that point, only days away. Back to the first island where everything began, quietly, to go wrong. The 12 ships that left Troy did not sail directly into disaster. That is worth saying plainly, because it would be easy to imagine Odysseus's journey as one long unbroken catastrophe from the very first day. It was not. The opening stretch of the voyage was, in fact, almost ordinary. Coastal waters, familiar currents, the kind of sailing 10 years of war had made these men entirely competent at managing. The trouble began, as trouble in this story so often does, with a decision. Not far from Troy, on the coast of Thrace, lay a town called Ismarus, home to a people called the Cicones, who had fought as allies of Troy during the war. Odysseus and his men, still flush with the momentum of victory, and perhaps not yet ready to set down the habits of 10 years of warfare, raided it. They sacked the town, took what plunder and provisions they could carry, and, this is the detail that matters, Odysseus urged his men to leave quickly afterward, sensing correctly that the Cicones would regroup and return in force. His men did not listen. Consider what that refusal reveals, this early in the story. These were not disciplined soldiers marching under strict command. They were tired, greedy, 10 years removed from their homes and their harvests, and utterly unwilling to leave good wine and good plunder behind simply because their captain sensed danger. They stayed on that beach, feasting, while Odysseus's warnings went unheeded, and by morning, the Cicones returned with reinforcements from inland allies and drove them back to their ships in a hard, costly fight. 6 men from each of Odysseus's 12 ships died in that retreat, a devastating loss, and one that occurred not because of any monster or god, but because of ordinary human recklessness, entirely preventable, entirely his men's own doing. This is worth pausing on because it establishes a pattern that will recur throughout the voyage. The crew's fate is not simply something that happens to them from outside, again and again. Their own choices, hunger overriding caution, curiosity overriding instruction, greed overriding fear, will prove just as dangerous as any monster waiting ahead. Odysseus is their captain, their strategist, occasionally their savior. He is never quite able to fully control them. Battered and reduced, the fleet pushed on, and here the story shifts from something recognizably historical. A raid, a retreat, a battle casualty count that would not be out of place in any Bronze Age military record, into something else entirely. A storm caught them near Cape Malea, the treacherous southern tip of the Peloponnese, a stretch of water sailors in the ancient Mediterranean genuinely feared, and blew them for 9 days, off every known route, out past the edges of the world the Greeks understood. When the winds finally calmed, Odysseus's ships had drifted into waters no chart, no memory, no experienced sailor's knowledge could account for. It is a small narrative choice worth noticing. The moment Odysseus's story leaves the world of ordinary geography, Thrace, Cape Malea, places a listener in that era could point to on a real coastline, is also the moment his story leaves the world of ordinary danger. From here forward, the threats he faces will not be rival tribes or bad weather. They will be things that should not, by any natural law, exist at all. The 9-day storm functions almost like a curtain being drawn, separating the historical war Odysseus fought from the mythic ordeal he is now entering. On the 10th day, the wind dropped them on the shore of a quiet, unfamiliar land. There was no violence waiting for them there, no monster, no army. That, in its way, made the island of the Lotus Eaters more unsettling than almost anything that came after it. Odysseus sent 3 men ashore to scout the land and its people, a reasonable, cautious decision, exactly the kind of leadership that had kept his ships intact through worse dangers than this. The inhabitants they found were not hostile. They offered no threat, raised no weapons, showed no cruelty at all. They simply offered his scouts food, the lotus. We do not know with any precision what this plant was meant to represent botanically. Later scholars have proposed various real Mediterranean and North African plants as candidates, but the tradition itself is not interested in botanical accuracy. What it is interested in is effect. Whoever ate the honeyed fruit of the lotus lost, immediately and completely, any desire to return home, not their memory. Exactly. The sources are careful about this distinction, but their will, the want to go home, the ache that had been driving every one of these exhausted men across 9 days of storm and years of war, simply dissolved, replaced by a boneless, perfect contentment to stay exactly where they were, eating lotus forever. This is worth sitting with, because it is arguably the gentlest and most quietly devastating danger Odysseus's men encounter in the entire journey. Every other threat ahead of them, a giant's cave, a witch's spell, a monster's jaws, announces itself as danger. The lotus does not. It offers only peace. It asks nothing violent of anyone. It simply removes the reason to keep going. Perhaps this is why, of all the trials in the story, the Lotus Eaters have lodged themselves so persistently in later imagination, in literature, in language itself, where lotus eating still describes a life of drifting, indifferent pleasure, cut loose from purpose or striving. It is difficult to know exactly what the earliest audiences of this story made of the episode, whether they read it primarily as a warning about foreign temptation, about the seduction of ease after 10 years of hardship, or simply about how fragile the human will to strive for anything can be when comfort is offered without cost. Perhaps it was, and remains, all of these things at once. Odysseus's 3 scouts did not return. When he went ashore himself to find them, he discovered men who no longer wished to be found. Men weeping, according to the tradition, when he ordered them back to the ships, not from pain, but from the loss of the drugged contentment they had briefly known. They did not want rescue. They had to be dragged bodily back to the ships, and, this detail matters, physically bound beneath the rowing benches, restrained like prisoners, so they would not leap overboard and swim back to the shore of their own forgetting. It is a strange image to hold in mind. Odysseus's own men, tied down not to prevent an enemy's escape, but to save them from a paradise that would have quietly erased everything they were sailing toward. Wife, child, home, name, all of it abandoned, willingly, for the taste of a flower. Odysseus gave the order to row away immediately, refusing to let any other man so much as taste the fruit, and did not look back until the island had shrunk into the horizon. That small detail becomes important later. This idea of forgetting as a genuine danger, every bit of real as a monster's teeth. It will return, transformed, on the island of a witch named Circe, and again, in its most complete and seductive form, on the island of a nymph named Calypso, where the temptation to simply stop striving will not last a single afternoon, but 7 long years. For now, though, the ships pulled free of the Lotus Island's quiet shore, carrying a crew that had learned, some of them unwillingly, weeping at the oars, that not every danger in this world would come with teeth. The next one would. There is one story, among all the trials Odysseus faced on his way home, that has traveled further and lodged deeper into human memory than any other. Ask someone who has never read a word of Homer to name a single episode from the Odyssey, and more often than not, this is the one they will reach for. The one-eyed giant, the trick of the false name, the burning stake driven into a monstrous eye. It has been retold in countless forms, across countless cultures, for nearly 3,000 years. It is worth asking why before we tell it, and the answer, I think, is that this is the episode where Odysseus's greatest gift and his greatest flaw finally reveal themselves to be the same trait, wearing 2 different faces. The ships left the island of the Lotus Eaters and sailed on until they reached a green, fertile land inhabited by a race the tradition calls the Cyclopes, giant, one-eyed beings who lived apart from one another, each in his own cave, with no laws, no assemblies, no shared government of any kind. Consider what that detail alone tells an ancient audience. In the world this story comes from, civilization was measured largely by exactly these things. By whether a people gathered in councils, honored guests, worshipped the gods properly, farmed the land through labor, rather than simply taking whatever grew wild. The Cyclopes, by this measure, were not merely dangerous. They were, in the deepest sense the Greeks understood, uncivilized, living outside every structure that made a society recognizably human. Odysseus, ever curious, ever slightly too confident in his own judgment, decided to investigate. He left the bulk of his fleet, anchored at a small, safe island nearby, and took only one ship and its crew to explore the mainland, a reasonable precaution on the surface. But then he made a choice that would cost him dearly, and it is worth naming plainly, without excusing it, because the story itself does not excuse it. He chose to bring along a skin of extraordinarily potent wine, a gift he had received earlier from a priest of Apollo, thinking, in his own words, as later tradition records them, that he might encounter someone of great strength, wild, without any knowledge of justice or law, and that such a gift might prove useful. He was not wrong that he would need it, but notice what this reveals about him. even before the danger begins. Odysseus did not stumble into the Cyclops' cave by accident. He walked toward the possibility of exactly this kind of danger, curious to see what he would find, confident, as he so often was, that his cleverness would be equal to whatever waited for him. It very nearly was not. The cave they found, when they climbed up from the shore, was enormous. Pens full of lambs and kids, wheels of cheese stacked along the walls, vessels of milk lined up in orderly rows. Odysseus's men, exhausted and hungry, urged him to take what they needed and leave immediately before whatever lived here returned. He refused. This is worth pausing on because it is the first of several moments in this episode where Odysseus's curiosity directly overrides his men's good sense, and where, this time, their good sense would have been the wiser course. He wanted, he later admitted, to see the creature who lived here himself, and to discover whether it would offer them the guest gifts that hospitality in this world demanded of any host toward any traveler. That expectation of hospitality, called xenia in the Greek tradition, was not a minor social nicety. It was one of the deepest moral obligations in this culture, protected directly by Zeus himself in his aspect as god of guests and strangers. A host who mistreated a traveler risked divine punishment. A traveler had every reason to expect, by ancient custom, safety and welcome beneath any roof he entered. Polyphemus, the Cyclops whose cave this was, had never learned this rule, or had learned it and rejected it entirely. When he returned that evening, driving his flocks in before him, and sealing the cave's entrance with a boulder so massive that, the tradition specifies, not even several teams of men could have moved it together, he found strangers inside his home, and responded not with welcome, but by seizing 2 of Odysseus's men, dashing them against the floor, and eating them raw, bones and all, for his evening meal. It is difficult to overstate how completely this scene would have horrified an audience for whom hospitality was sacred. This was not simply violence, it was the deliberate, monstrous inversion of one of the most fundamental moral rules their world was built on: a host devouring his guests instead of feeding them, trapped inside a sealed cave with a creature who had just demonstrated, in the most horrifying terms possible, exactly what kind of danger they faced. Odysseus did not panic. He watched, waited, and began, already, to think. The strategy he devised over the following exchange is, even after nearly 3,000 years, a genuinely elegant piece of problem-solving, and it deserves to be walked through carefully because every piece of it matters. First, he offered Polyphemus wine, the same potent, undiluted wine he had brought from the priest of Apollo, wine strong enough that ordinary practice called for mixing it heavily with water before drinking. Polyphemus, unfamiliar with wine of this strength, drank it eagerly and asked for more. Then, when the giant, pleased and growing careless with drink, offered Odysseus a guest gift of his own in return, asking his name, Odysseus gave an answer that has become, arguably, the single most famous piece of wordplay in the history of storytelling. "My name is nobody," he said. Hold on to that detail. It will matter again, more than once before this story ends. The idea of Odysseus concealing his true identity behind a name, choosing deliberately to become no one in order to survive. It is the first time in the story he does this. It will not be the last. And by the time we reach Ithaca itself, disguised and unrecognized in his own hall. We will see this same strategy played out on a far larger and more consequential stage. Polyphemus, drunk and amused, told nobody that he would eat him last as a special favor, and then fell into a heavy, wine-soaked sleep. This was the moment Odysseus and his remaining men had been waiting for. They had already prepared a weapon, a massive olive wood staff, cut from a length of green wood they had found in the cave, its point sharpened and hardened in the fire. Together, several men driving it with all their combined strength, they plunged the heated point into the sleeping giant's single eye, twisting it the way a shipwright twists a drill through a ship's timber, a comparison the tradition itself uses, drawn deliberately from the ordinary, human world of craftsmen and tools, grounding this monstrous moment in something physically real and comprehensible. Polyphemus's scream brought the other Cyclopes from their neighboring caves, calling out to ask what was wrong, whether someone was attacking him, whether he needed help. "Nobody is killing me by treachery, not by force," Polyphemus shouted back in genuine agony. And the other Cyclopes, hearing this, simply turned around and went back to their own caves. If nobody was attacking him, they reasoned, then he must be suffering from some sickness or divine affliction. Nothing they could help with, nothing requiring their intervention. It is worth sitting with the sheer elegance of this trick. Odysseus did not merely conceal his name from Polyphemus, he weaponized the concealment itself, turning a simple word game into the very thing that isolated the wounded giant from the one force that could have saved him. His own kin, standing right outside the door, sent away by a joke they never even realized had been made at their expense. Blinded, but not disabled, Polyphemus rolled the massive boulder from the cave's entrance the next morning to let his flocks out to graze, positioning himself in the doorway, hands spread wide, to catch any man who tried to slip past him on 2 feet. Odysseus's solution to this final obstacle is, if anything, even more carefully engineered than the wine trick that preceded it. He bound his remaining men, 3 at a time, beneath the bellies of the giant's own rams, using the twisted willow branches from Polyphemus's own bed as rope, lashing them to the middle animal of each group of 3, so that Polyphemus's groping hands, checking the backs of his flock as they passed, would feel only wool, never realizing what was hidden underneath. For himself, Odysseus chose the largest ram in the flock, the one Polyphemus was clearly most fond of, and clung to its underside as it passed through the doorway last of all. Polyphemus, still in agony, still grieving his sudden blindness, actually spoke to that ram as it passed beneath his hands, asking, almost tenderly, why it lagged behind the others today of all days, when normally it led the flock eagerly out to pasture, wondering aloud whether it, too, grieved for its master's ruined eye. There is something genuinely unsettling about this moment, and I think it is meant to be. For just a few lines, Polyphemus stops being purely monstrous and becomes, briefly, almost pitiable, a wounded creature confiding in an animal, unaware that his enemy is clinging to its underside, close enough to hear every word of his grief. The ram carried Odysseus safely out through the doorway and into the daylight. Here the story could have ended cleanly. A narrow escape, a clever trick, a safe return to the ships waiting at anchor, and for a moment, it very nearly did. Odysseus got his men to their ship, loaded Polyphemus's own flocks aboard as plunder, and pushed off from the shore. It was enough. He had outwitted a monster, escaped with his life and most of his crew, and could have simply sailed on toward home, the danger fully behind him. Instead, once they had rowed out to what he judged a safe distance, Odysseus turned back toward the shore and shouted his true name. This is the single most consequential decision Odysseus makes in the entire journey, and it is worth asking honestly why he made it. His men begged him not to. They understood, even if he did not yet fully allow himself to, that taunting a wounded giant who could hurl boulders large enough to nearly swamp their ship, which Polyphemus, guided by the sound of Odysseus's voice, promptly did, very nearly capsizing them, was an unnecessary risk purchased for nothing but pride. But pride here is not quite the whole story either. Consider what it would have meant in the world this story comes from. For Odysseus to escape by a clever trick and then vanish anonymously, to let nobody remain his only name in this encounter forever, in a culture that prized kleos, lasting glory and reputation, an anonymous victory was, in a real sense, only half a victory. What good was outwitting a monster if no one, not even the monster himself, ever knew whose cunning had done it? So, Odysseus shouted his name across the water. Odysseus, son of Laertes, sacker of cities, of Ithaca. He needed the giant and the story that would follow him to know exactly whose triumph this was. It is difficult to know exactly how the earliest audiences of this story judged that decision, whether they read it as understandable, even admirable, or as a genuine and costly flaw, a moment where the hero's hunger for glory overrode the wisdom that had kept him and his men alive through everything up to this point. Perhaps, honestly, it was meant to be both at once. What we do know, because the story tells us directly and repeatedly in the acts that follow, is the cost. Polyphemus, hearing that name, did something that changed the entire remainder of Odysseus's journey. He was, the tradition specifies, the son of the sea god Poseidon himself. And blinded, humiliated, robbed of his flocks, he lifted his hands toward the sea and prayed to his father, not simply for revenge in some general sense, but for something devastatingly specific: that Odysseus should never reach home at all, or if fate had already decreed that he must, that he should arrive late, having lost all his companions in someone else's ship, and find only trouble waiting for him there. Every single detail of that prayer, we will discover, comes true. This is the seed that was planted back on the smoking beach at Troy. In Act 1, Poseidon's grievance against the Greek fleet in general, still simmering, unresolved. Now, it has a name attached to it, a face, a specific and personal reason to pursue one particular man across the length of the entire sea. What had been a diffuse divine irritation becomes, from this moment forward, a focused, relentless campaign. And everything that happens to Odysseus for the rest of this story, every storm, every detour, every drowned companion, will trace back, in one way or another, to this single moment. A wounded giant, a name shouted across open water, and a father god who heard his son's prayer and decided to answer it in full. Odysseus sailed on from that shore, believing perhaps that he had won. In the most immediate sense, he had. But there is a particular kind of victory that costs far more than it appears to in the moment it is won. And this was one of them. He would spend the next 9 years discovering exactly how much. After the horror of the Cyclops' cave, the ships that pulled away from that shore carried a crew that had changed in ways not everyone aboard fully understood yet. They had watched their captain's decision to shout his name into the wind cost them nearly their lives, watched a boulder nearly swamp their ship in the taunted giant's fury. Some of them, we can reasonably imagine, had begun to wonder whether following Odysseus's instincts was quite as safe as it had once seemed. They sailed on, and the sea for a while seemed to relent. They came next to a floating island, Aeolia, home of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. This was a strange and, in its own way, almost comfortable place after the horror they had just escaped. A walled island of bronze, ringed by unbreakable cliffs, home to a king who lived in extraordinary domestic contentment, with his 6 sons and 6 daughters, married to one another in pairs, feasting together endlessly in a hall filled with music and the smell of roasting meat. It is worth noting how deliberately this scene is built to contrast with what came before it, where Polyphemus lived alone, lawless, devouring guests instead of honoring them. Aeolus presides over an almost excessive vision of order, family, and hospitality, the two extremes of what a host could be, set one after another, so the listener feels the difference. Aeolus welcomed Odysseus and his men warmly, housed them for a full month, and listened with genuine interest to the story of the war at Troy and everything that had happened since. When Odysseus finally asked for the king's help getting home, Aeolus gave him something extraordinary: a leather bag made from the hide of an ox, in which he had bound up every contrary wind in the world, every gust and gale that might blow a ship off course, leaving free only the gentle west wind, Zephyrus, which would carry Odysseus's ships directly, swiftly, safely home to Ithaca. It is worth pausing on the sheer generosity of this gift, because it makes what follows so much harder to bear. Aeolus did not merely wish Odysseus well. He handed him, quite literally, control over the very forces that had scattered his fleet and delayed his voyage. For the first time since leaving Troy, Odysseus held his fate, genuinely, mechanically, in his own hands. They sailed for 9 days and 9 nights, the west wind carrying them steadily home, and Odysseus himself held the rudder the entire time, refusing to sleep, refusing to hand off control to anyone else, trusting no one else with a task this important. On the 10th day, Ithaca came into view. Consider what that moment must have meant. 10 years of war, nearly a year by this point, of disaster and detour since leaving Troy. And now, finally, close enough that Odysseus could see cooking fires burning on the shore of his own island. Close enough, the tradition tells us, that he could make out figures moving on the beach. And here, exhausted after 9 sleepless days at the helm, believing the worst was finally behind him, Odysseus allowed himself, at last, to close his eyes. This is the moment worth sitting with, because it is not a monster or a god that undoes him here. It is his own exhaustion, combined with something else entirely, the quiet, festering curiosity of the men he commanded. While Odysseus slept, his crew began to talk among themselves, eyeing the leather bag that had sat, mysterious and untouched, at his feet for 9 days. They had watched him receive it from Aeolus in private. They had watched him guard it jealously the entire voyage, refusing to explain its contents to anyone, refusing to let any other hand touch it. And now, with home in sight and their captain finally deeply asleep, their imaginations filled in what his silence had left empty. They convinced themselves it was treasure, gold and silver, some private gift from the Wind King that Odysseus intended to keep for himself and deny to the men who had fought and bled and rode beside him the entire way home. It is worth noticing how naturally this suspicion took root. These were men who had spent 10 years at war, watching commanders divide plunder unequally, who had already sacrificed 6 comrades apiece to a raid at Ismarus for the sake of goods, who had every reason, from hard experience, to expect exactly this kind of secrecy from a leader hoarding wealth. Their mistake was not born of foolishness alone. It was born of a world that had taught them repeatedly to expect betrayal from the men above them. So, within sight of the very shore they had spent a year trying to reach, they opened the bag. Every contrary wind Aeolus had bound inside came howling out at once, a violent, chaotic gale that seized the ships and drove them backward, away from Ithaca, away from home, back out across the entire length of sea they had just spent 9 days crossing, all the way back to Aeolia itself. Odysseus woke to chaos, to his ships being torn away from the coastline of his own kingdom by a storm his own men had unleashed, and in that moment, the tradition is honest about this. He considered, seriously, throwing himself into the sea rather than continue living with what had just happened. He did not do it. He endured it, as he would learn, again and again, to endure nearly everything this voyage demanded of him. But it is worth noting that this despair was real, named directly in the story rather than smoothed over. A reminder that the calm, clever strategist of the Cyclops' cave was still, underneath everything, a man capable of being broken by bad luck and other people's mistakes. The ships were driven all the way back to Aeolia's shore. When Odysseus went, humiliated, to ask Aeolus for help a second time, the king's response was immediate and final. He refused, not with anger exactly, but with something closer to a settled, frightened certainty. A man who could sail within sight of his own home and still lose it, Aeolus reasoned, must be hated by the gods themselves, cursed in some way beyond an ordinary mortal's help. To assist him further would risk drawing that same divine anger down onto Aeolia. He ordered Odysseus from his island immediately, offering no second gift, no further hospitality, nothing but the door. This is worth pausing on because it marks something significant in how the story is beginning to characterize Odysseus's misfortune. Aeolus's refusal is the first moment another mortal explicitly names what the audience already knows from the Council of the Gods, back in Act 3, that this is not simply bad luck. Some specific, deliberate divine hostility is following this man, visible enough now that even strangers can sense it and want no part of it. The ships pushed off from Aeolia's shore a second time, but this time there was no gift of favorable winds waiting to carry them home. They would have to row. It is worth noticing what has actually been lost here, beyond the simple delay. Twice now, Odysseus's fate has been placed almost entirely in his own hands, and twice now it has slipped away, not through any monster's malice, but through the ordinary human frailty of the men around him. First, his crew's hunger and greed cost them dearly among the Cyclones. Now their suspicion and mistrust have undone a gift that would have carried them all the way home. There is a hard, unsentimental honesty in how this story treats leadership. Odysseus is extraordinarily capable, clever enough to blind a Cyclops and escape, skilled enough to hold a ship's rudder alone for 9 straight days without rest. But he cannot fully control the fears and appetites of the men who follow him, and this voyage will punish that gap over and over until almost none of them are left to punish. Rowing now, without the wind's help, exhausted, demoralized, having glimpsed home only to watch it torn away again, the fleet pressed on into waters that would prove, very shortly, to be the deadliest they had yet encountered. Waters where the danger this time would come not from a single captured wind, but from an enemy far larger, far more numerous, and far less interested in bargaining than anything they had faced so far. There is a particular kind of dread that comes not from facing one monster, but from facing an entire nation of them. What happened next to Odysseus's fleet was not a single ambush or a single trick gone wrong. It was something closer to a massacre, and it happened so quickly, so completely, that by the time it was over, 11 of Odysseus's 12 ships, and every man who had sailed on them, were simply gone. It is worth telling this one plainly, and without much ornament, because that is closer to how the story itself tells it. Some disasters deserve a slow build. This one, in the tradition, arrives almost without warning, which is precisely what makes it so devastating. After 6 days of hard rowing from Aeolia, 6 days without the wind's help, 6 days of exhausted men pulling oars in silence, still shaken by how close they had come to home and how completely it had been taken from them, the fleet reached a strange harbor on the 7th. It should have looked, to experienced sailors, like extraordinarily good fortune. The harbor was almost perfectly enclosed, steep cliffs rising on either side, sheltering the water inside from any wind or swell at all. So calm, the tradition specifies, that no wave rose within it, not even a ripple. 11 of the 12 captains, reading this as the safest anchorage they had found on the entire voyage, brought their ships all the way in, tying up close together along the shore. Odysseus did not. This is worth pausing on, because it is one of the few moments in the entire voyage where his particular kind of caution, earned, by this point, through hard experience, actually preserved lives rather than endangering them. Something about the harbor unsettled him. Perhaps it was simply the memory of how quickly hospitality had turned to horror in the Cyclops' cave, or how completely a moment of safety had unraveled within sight of Ithaca itself. Whatever the reason, he chose to moor his own ship outside the harbor's mouth, tied to a rock at the very edge of the bay, keeping open water and an escape route at his back. That single decision, a captain's instinct, nothing more, would be the only thing separating him from total annihilation within the hour. Odysseus sent 3 scouts inland to learn what kind of people lived in this place, the same cautious procedure that had, on the island of the Lotus Eaters, at least given him warning of the danger before it was too late. This time, the warning came too late for the scouts themselves, though it would prove to be enough to save their captain. The scouts followed a road inland and encountered, first, a young woman drawing water at a spring, the daughter, as it turned out, of the king of this land, a people called the Laestrygonians. She directed them, without apparent malice, to her father's hall. What waited there was not remotely human in scale. The king's wife, when the scouts entered, was described as being the size of a mountain peak, and at the sight of her, the men's instincts, finally, caught up with their danger, they turned to flee. It was already too late for 2 of the 3. The king seized one of them immediately, and the tradition tells us in language that echoes deliberately back to Polyphemus's cave, made a meal of him. The third scout ran. What happened next unfolded with a speed that gives this episode its particular, horrifying character. This was not a monster stalking a single victim through a cave over the course of a long night, as Polyphemus had done. This was an entire population, mobilized at once. As the surviving scout fled back toward the harbor, the Laestrygonians raised the alarm across their whole territory. Thousands of them. The tradition describes them as giants, monstrous in size and number both, came pouring down from the cliffs surrounding that perfectly enclosed harbor, the very cliffs that had made the anchorage look so safe to 11 trusting captains. And here the trap fully revealed itself. The harbor's narrow, sheltered shape, which had seemed like such fortunate protection from the sea, became instead a killing ground with no way out. The Laestrygonians stood on the high cliffs above the tightly moored ships and began hurling boulders down onto them, not one or two thrown in anger, as Polyphemus had done in his blind, wounded rage, but a sustained, coordinated bombardment, shattering hull after hull, boat after boat, trapping the men aboard with no room to maneuver, no space to turn and flee, hemmed in on every side by cliffs and by each other's crowded ships. Those who survived the boulders and went into the water were speared, the tradition tells us, like fish, gathered up for a meal, the same fate the scouts inside the hall had already met. Odysseus, moored outside the harbor's mouth, watched this happen. There was nothing he could have done to stop it. 11 ships, hundreds of men, destroyed within what must have been minutes, in a bay he had no way to reach in time even if he had tried. What he could do, and did, was survive. He drew his sword, cut the rope mooring his own ship to the rock at the harbor's edge, and shouted to his remaining crew to row, not toward the disaster to try to help, which would have meant certain death for everyone, but away from it, out into open water, as fast as the oars could pull them. It is worth sitting honestly with what this moment asks us to feel, because the story does not soften it or explain it away. Odysseus escaped. His men rowed for their lives, while behind them 11 ships' worth of companions. Men who had fought beside them at Troy, sacked Ismarus beside them, been bound at the oars together on the island of the Lotus Eaters, nearly drowned together when the bag of winds was opened, were slaughtered, and there was nothing to be done about it except live. This is, I think, one of the most quietly devastating turns in the entire story, precisely because it offers no monster to blame beyond the Laestrygonians themselves, no trick that went wrong, no crew's foolishness that caused it. It was simply bad fortune, compounded by the fact that 11 captains made a reasonable judgment that happened to be catastrophically wrong, and one captain's private unease happened to be right. There is no lesson here that guarantees safety next time. There is only the fact that Odysseus this time survived, and hundreds of men who trusted the same instincts that had brought them safely out of Troy did not. When the single surviving ship finally reached open water, what was left of Odysseus's expedition had been reduced in the space of one catastrophic hour from 12 ships to 1. It is worth pausing here to register the scale of what has just happened to this story, because it changes everything that follows. Odysseus left Troy as the commander of a substantial fleet. 12 ships, several hundred men, a war band capable of raiding a town, defending itself against hostile strangers, absorbing losses and continuing on. From this point forward, he commands a single crew, a fraction of the men he set out with. Every subsequent danger, facing a group with far less capacity to survive further loss. Notice, too, what has quietly happened to the shape of the story itself. Until now, this has been, in some sense, an ensemble voyage. 12 ships making collective decisions, 12 crews sharing collective fates, disasters distributed, however unevenly, across an entire fleet. From here forward, it narrows. One ship, one crew, growing smaller with each new island, each new danger. The story is closing in, act by act, toward what it was always quietly building toward. A single man, eventually entirely alone, having to decide again and again what he is willing to lose in order to keep going. They rode on in a silence that must have been very different from any silence they had known before. Grief, this time, riding alongside them in a boat far emptier than it had been that morning. Ahead of them, though none of them yet knew it, lay an island where a very different kind of danger was waiting. Not violence this time, but transformation and a temptation that would prove, in its own quiet way, nearly as costly as everything that had come before it. Grief has a particular weight when there is nowhere to set it down. Odysseus and the remnant of his crew, one ship's worth of men out of the 12 that had sailed from Troy, rowed on from the wreckage of the Laestrygonian harbor, carrying something heavier than exhaustion. They had watched hundreds of companions die in the space of an hour, watched it happen close enough to see but too far to help. And there had been no time, no safe shore, to properly grieve any of it before the sea demanded they keep moving. They landed, eventually, on a wooded island called Aiaia, and for 2 full days did nothing at all but lie on the beach, worn through with sorrow and fatigue. It is a small detail, easy to skip past, but worth noticing. Even a story built around relentless forward motion pauses here to let its characters simply stop, to let grief exist without immediately being put to use. On the 3rd day, Odysseus climbed a height to survey the land and saw smoke rising from a dwelling somewhere inland. The first sign, since the massacre, that this new island held anyone at all. He divided his remaining men into 2 companies, drew lots to decide who would investigate, and the lot fell to a man named Eurylochus, who would prove, in the acts ahead, to be one of the more consequential secondary figures in the entire voyage, a man whose caution, ironically, would sometimes serve the crew better than his captain's curiosity, and whose fear, at other times, would very nearly cost them everything. Eurylochus led 22 men inland and found, in a forest clearing, a grand house built of polished stone, surrounded, and this detail should unsettle any listener before a single word of dialogue is spoken, by wolves and mountain lions that did not attack. Instead, the animals approached the men gently, almost affectionately, rising up on their hind legs, the way dogs greet a returning master. These were not tame beasts. We will learn shortly exactly what they were, and the men should perhaps have understood sooner than they did that an island where wild predators behave like household pets is not an island governed by ordinary laws of nature. From inside the house came the sound of a woman singing beautifully while she worked at a great loom. The men called out to her, and she emerged at once, welcoming them with every appearance of warmth. inviting them inside, seating them, offering a meal of cheese, barley, and honey mixed into wine. Every man went inside except Eurylochus, who lingered at the threshold, suspicious in a way he could not quite articulate even to himself. It is worth pausing on this instinct, because it is the second time in 2 acts that caution born of nothing more than unease has proven wiser than any concrete evidence. First, Odysseus's decision not to bring his ship into the Laestrygonian harbor. Now, Eurylochus's refusal to cross this particular threshold. The story seems, quietly, to be building an argument that some of the deadliest dangers in this voyage give warning only in the form of a feeling, and the men who survive are, more often than not, the ones willing to trust that feeling, even without being able to explain it. His instinct was entirely correct. The woman was Circe, a goddess and enchantress, and the meal she served her guests was laced with a drug that stripped away their memory of home entirely. And once they had eaten it, she struck each man with her wand and transformed them, bodily, into pigs. Their minds, the tradition specifies with a particular cruelty, remained fully human, even as their bodies became animal. They understood exactly what had happened to them, penned now in her sty, weeping in a way no true pig could weep. Eurylochus ran back to the ship alone, so shaken by what he had witnessed through the doorway that he could barely speak the story coherently. When he finally managed to explain, he begged Odysseus not to go anywhere near the house himself, urging instead that they abandon the 22 transformed men entirely and flee the island while they still could. Odysseus refused, and it is worth noting that this refusal, unlike some of his earlier displays of stubborn pride, reads in the tradition as something closer to genuine loyalty than recklessness. He would not leave men behind, however dangerous the rescue. He set out alone toward the house, over Eurylochus's continued objections. On the path, he was intercepted by the god Hermes, disguised as a young man, a direct, small-scale echo of the divine intervention we saw arranged back at the Council of the Gods in Act 3, and a reminder that Odysseus's survival, however much it depends on his own cunning, has never been entirely his own doing. Hermes warned him plainly about Circe's power and gave him a plant called moly, black-rooted, white-flowered, a plant the tradition says only a god could safely dig from the earth, which would protect him from her drug. This is worth pausing on because it marks a meaningful shift in how divine help has functioned in the story so far. Athena's assistance to Telemachus was subtle, a disguise, a suggestion, a door left open for him to walk through himself. Hermes' gift here is direct, physical, unmistakably supernatural. Odysseus is, for the first time in the voyage, handed a tool no mortal cunning could have produced on its own. It does not diminish what follows. It simply reminds us that even this most self-reliant of heroes survives ultimately within limits he did not set and cannot fully control. Armed with the moly, Odysseus entered the house, ate the drugged meal Circe offered him, and felt nothing when she struck him with her wand, expecting him to drop onto all fours like every man before him. Nothing happened at all, and in that failure, Circe understood immediately that she was dealing with someone protected by a power greater than her own. She recognized him, in fact, before he ever gave his name. Hermes, it turned out, had warned her 2 years before that a man named Odysseus would one day arrive at her island, resistant to her magic, on his way home from Troy. This is worth noting because it means the encounter that follows is not, on Circe's side, entirely a surprise. She had been waiting, in a sense, for exactly this arrival. Frightened and disarmed, she dropped to her knees and begged for mercy, and Odysseus, following instructions Hermes had also given him, made her swear a formal, binding oath before compelling her to restore his men. This is where the episode does something the story has not quite done before. Circe does not simply release Odysseus and his men once she is bested. She invites them to stay, and they do, not for a night, not for a week, but for a full year, feasting, resting, restored fully to health and strength, after the accumulated exhaustion and grief of everything since Troy. It would be easy to read this simply as another temptation, another version of the Lotus that nearly stole Odysseus's men's will to go home. And there is something to that reading. A year is a long time, and it is Odysseus's own crew, eventually, who have to remind him that home still waits, that Ithaca has not stopped existing simply because this island has proven so comfortable. But it is worth noticing what makes this pause different from the Lotus, or from what awaits him later with Calypso. Circe's hospitality, once Odysseus has bested her, becomes genuine rather than predatory. She restores his men fully, not merely returning them to human shape, but making them, the tradition specifies, younger and more handsome than they had been before. A small, strange grace note of healing after so much loss. And crucially, when the year finally ends and Odysseus asks to leave, Circe does not resist or delay him. She helps him. She tells him, plainly and at length, what still lies ahead. And this guidance turns out to be the single most important thing anyone gives him on the entire voyage. Notice what has changed here. Every previous island offered Odysseus danger disguised as safety, or safety indistinguishable from a trap. Circe's island, for the first time, offers something closer to what an actual ally would offer. Rest, honesty, and, when the year of rest is over, real information about the dangers still ahead. That information, when it came, was not comforting. Circe told Odysseus that before he could continue safely toward home, he first had to sail to the edge of the world and descend, while still living, to the house of the dead, to consult the blind prophet Tiresias, whose shade alone, among all the dead, retained the power of true prophecy even in death, and who alone could tell Odysseus the full shape of what remained of his journey. It is worth sitting with how strange and heavy this instruction is. Every trial so far, the Cyclops, the winds, the Laestrygonians, even Circe herself, has been an obstacle Odysseus had to survive and move past. This is different. This is not an obstacle in his path. It is a deliberate detour into the realm of the dead, undertaken not because it stands between him and home, but because Circe insists it is the only way to learn what still stands between him and home at all. Odysseus's men, when he told them what awaited, were terrified, understandably. No living man, in the tradition this story draws on, had ever undertaken quite this journey and returned. But there was no other way forward that Circe was willing to offer. And so, when the ship was provisioned and the year of rest had properly ended, they set sail once more. Not toward Ithaca this time, not yet, but toward the edge of everything, toward a shore where the sun does not rise, to speak with the dead about how a living man might still find his way home there. is a particular kind of courage, required to sail deliberately toward the one place every living person eventually goes without ever choosing to. Odysseus's men had faced giants, storms, and a witch who turned strangers into swine. What Circe now asked of them was different in kind, not merely in degree, and it is worth pausing before the ship even leaves her island to notice how this single instruction reshapes the entire remaining journey. Everything before this point has been about survival, outrunning danger, outwitting captors, escaping islands that wanted to keep them. What follows now is something closer to a reckoning. Odysseus is not simply trying to get past the underworld. He is going there on purpose, because the truth he needs can be found nowhere else. This is the moment the voyage stops being only an adventure and becomes something closer to a confrontation with mortality itself, his own and everyone else's. Following Circe's precise instructions, they sailed north across open water until they reached the edge of the world as this tradition understood it. The land of the Cimmerians, a people the poem describes as living in permanent mist and cloud, never touched by the sun's rays at any hour of day or night. It is worth noticing how carefully this geography refuses to be pinned down to any real coastline. Unlike Thrace or Cape Malea earlier in the voyage, this is not a place a Bronze Age sailor could have located on any chart. It exists at the boundary where the world Odysseus knows ends, and something else entirely begins. There, following Circe's instructions exactly, Odysseus dug a pit, poured offerings of honey, milk, sweet wine, water, and barley into it, and sacrificed a black ram and ewe, letting their blood pool into the trench. The blood, Circe had told him, would draw the shades of the dead toward him, giving them, briefly, enough substance to speak, but only after he had first found and questioned the shade of Tiresias, the prophet he had come for. Any other soul that approached too soon had to be kept back, at sword's point if necessary, until the prophet had been served. The dead came in crowds, brides who had died before their wedding nights, young men cut down before their time, old warriors still marked by old wounds, all crowding toward the scent of blood, all reaching for the chance, however brief, to speak again. It is a striking, almost overwhelming image. The idea that death does not erase the desire to be heard, only the ability. Among the first shades to approach, before Odysseus could even complete the proper sacrifice, was one he recognized immediately and had not expected to find here at all, Elpenor, the youngest of his men, who had died not in battle or shipwreck, but in the most ordinary, almost embarrassing way imaginable. On the night before they left Circe's island, still drunk from the previous evening's farewell feast, he had climbed onto her roof to sleep in the cool night air, forgotten entirely where he was upon waking, and fallen to his death, reaching for a ladder that was not there. In the haste of departure, no one had noticed he was missing until it was too late to bury him. This is worth pausing on because of what it does to the tone of the entire episode. We might expect the underworld sequence to open with something grand, a great warrior, a king, a figure of real consequence. Instead, the first conversation is with a young man who died from nothing more mythic than too much wine and a dark rooftop, begging Odysseus for the most basic dignity a dead person could ask for. A proper burial, a mound raised over his ashes, his oar planted upright as a marker so that he would not be forgotten by the living he left unburied and unmourned. Odysseus promised he would see to it. a promise we will see kept later, a small but genuine callback threading forward through the rest of the story. It is a quiet, almost unbearably human note to strike this early in a scene about confronting mortality at its grandest scale, that death does not sort itself neatly by heroism, and that even a hero's voyage is dotted with small, undignified endings that deserve just as much care as the great ones. Then came Tiresias, drinking from the blood as instructed, gathering enough of his old prophetic clarity to speak plainly about everything still to come. What he told Odysseus is worth walking through carefully because it functions as a map for the rest of the entire journey. The first time anyone has laid out, clearly and in order, exactly what still lies between this man and his home. Poseidon's anger, Tiresias confirmed, had not lessened. It would continue to hound Odysseus across the sea because of Polyphemus's blinding, and there was no undoing that grievance now, only surviving it. But Tiresias offered something more specific and more urgent than a general warning. He told Odysseus that his ship would eventually reach an island called Thrinacia, sacred pasture land belonging to the sun god Helios, where cattle grazed that no mortal was permitted to touch. If Odysseus and his men left those cattle alone, Tiresias said, they might yet reach home safely, however delayed and battered by the journey. But if they harmed even a single animal, disaster would follow, the ship destroyed, the men lost, and Odysseus himself arriving home eventually, but alone in a stranger's ship, having lost absolutely everyone who had sailed with him. Notice how precisely this foreshadows everything still to come. This is not a vague prophecy dressed in riddles. It is a direct, specific warning, given plainly, with the exact consequence attached to the exact transgression. Whatever happens on Thrinacia in the acts ahead, and something will happen there, it will not be able to claim the excuse of surprise. Tiresias will have said it outright, here in this very scene. And then the prophet went further still, describing what waited even after Ithaca was reached. A house full of arrogant men consuming his household's wealth, a violent reckoning required to reclaim it, and, stranger and more distant than anything else in the prophecy, a final journey Odysseus would need to make after Ithaca was won back, carrying an oar inland, so far inland that he would eventually meet people who had never seen the sea and mistook the oar on his shoulder for a tool for winnowing grain, planting it there as an offering to Poseidon, finally making peace, in some fashion, with the god who had hunted him the length of the world. That last detail sits outside the boundaries of the story we are telling in full here, but it is worth mentioning because it tells us something important about how this narrative understands endings. Even the climax waiting in Ithaca, Tiresias implies, will not be the final resolution of everything this voyage has cost. Some grievances outlast even the confrontations that seem to settle them. With the prophecy given, Tiresias withdrew, and Odysseus allowed the other shades crowding the pit to come forward and drink, one at a time, restoring enough of their strength and memory to speak. The first was his own mother, Anticlea, and this is worth sitting with honestly because it is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire poem. Odysseus had not known she was dead. He had left her alive on Ithaca 10 years before he sailed for Troy, and in all the years since, no word had reached him of her passing. Now here, in the one place he never wanted to learn such news, he discovered it, that she had died not from illness or age exactly, but from grief and longing for him, unable to bear not knowing whether her son still lived. Twice, Odysseus reached out to embrace her shade. Twice, his arms closed on nothing, passing through her like smoke or a shadow, and each failure was, the tradition tells us plainly, its own fresh grief, a physical demonstration of exactly what death takes, the impossibility of touch, of comfort, of anything but words, passed across an unbridgeable distance. What does this tell us about the cost of this entire journey? Consider what Odysseus is discovering, piece by piece, in this one underworld scene. That time did not simply pause on Ithaca while he fought at Troy and wandered the sea afterward. It continued. People aged, people grieved, people died waiting for a return that, for all his mother knew, might never come. Every year Odysseus spends fighting a monster or resisting a temptation is a year that was also simultaneously happening at home, consuming a life he cannot get back, no matter how successfully he eventually completes this voyage. Other shades came forward after his mother, and among them, one conversation in particular is worth pausing on because it directly tests the central theme this entire story has been quietly building toward since Act 1. Achilles approached, greatest of all the warriors who had fought at Troy, the man whose glory in life had been almost unmatched among mortals. Odysseus, meeting him here, offered what he clearly intended as comfort and honor, telling Achilles that he had been powerful in life and must surely be honored now among the dead as a ruler of some kind, a great lord even in this shadowed realm. Achilles' answer is one of the most quietly radical moments in the entire tradition, and it deserves to be heard almost exactly as it lands, because it overturns, in a single reply, an entire value system the Greek world had built much of its poetry and its glory around. He said, in essence, that he would rather be a landless servant, working for the poorest man alive, scraping out the barest possible existence above the earth, than rule as king over all the dead below it. Consider what this does to everything we have watched Odysseus risk and endure so far. This entire voyage, indeed, the entire war at Troy before it, has been driven, in part, by the pursuit of Kleos, lasting glory, a name that outlives the body. Odysseus shouted his true name to a wounded Cyclops specifically, so his triumph would be remembered rather than anonymous. And here, from the single most glorified warrior of the entire war, comes the flattest possible rejection of whether any of that glory was worth what it cost. Achilles chose a short, brilliant, famous life over a long, quiet, unremembered one. Meeting him now, hollow and diminished among the shades, Odysseus is being shown, as directly as this story ever shows anything, what that choice actually purchased in the end. This is worth holding on to as the central hinge of the entire poem's midpoint. Everything before this scene has tested Odysseus's cunning, his ability to outwit monsters, manage his crew, survive circumstances designed to kill him. Everything after this scene will increasingly test something different. Whether he still wants, after everything, the ordinary, mortal, unglamorous life waiting for him on a small rocky island, or whether some part of him is still chasing the kind of undying fame that cost Achilles everything and satisfied him not at all. There were other shades still, a brief, painful account from Agamemnon of his own murder at the hands of his wife and her lover. Upon his return home from Troy, a warning, unmistakable and specific, about the dangers of trusting too easily in a homecoming, and about what can happen to a king who returns without caution to a house he assumes is still loyal. Hold that warning alongside everything we already know about Ithaca, the suitors, the danger to Telemachus, the uncertainty of what kind of welcome actually awaits Odysseus there. Agamemnon's fate is not offered as idle cautionary tale. It is direct, pointed foreshadowing, spoken by a man who learned its lesson too late to use it. Eventually, the crowding shades grew too numerous, too insistent, and Odysseus, shaken by everything he had seen and heard, gave the order to retreat to the ship. They rowed back out from the edge of the world, carrying with them not treasure, not victory, but something arguably more valuable and more dangerous both. Full knowledge, at last, of exactly what still lay ahead and exactly what it might cost. The voyage that had begun as an escape from Troy had become, somewhere in that mist-bound land of the dead, something closer to a reckoning with what home, glory, and survival were actually worth. Everything that follows from here will be measured against what Achilles said, what Agamemnon warned, and what Tiresias foretold. And the sea, patient as ever, was waiting to test every word of it. They sailed back from the edge of the world to Circe's island one final time, and it is worth noting how the story treats this return, not as another full episode, but as a brief, necessary pause. Circe had promised guidance for the dangers still ahead, and she kept that promise now in full, walking Odysseus through everything Tiresias had only sketched in outline. Where the prophet had spoken of a strait between monsters and cattle that must not be touched, Circe filled in the details a captain would actually need to survive them. But before any of that, she told him something else, something waiting immediately ahead, a danger so specific, so precisely tailored to human weakness, that it deserved its own careful preparation. The sirens, Circe explained, sang from a meadow on an island the ship would soon pass, a meadow littered, the tradition specifies, with the moldering bones and shriveled skin of every sailor who had ever heard their song and steered toward it. No one who listened had ever survived to tell what the song contained. No one who resisted it had ever needed to. This is worth pausing on, because it marks a genuinely new category of danger in a voyage that has, by this point, offered nearly every kind imaginable. Polyphemus threatened with brute strength. The Laestrygonians threatened with overwhelming numbers. Circe herself had threatened through transformation. The sirens threaten with none of these things. They offer no violence at all until a sailor has already doomed himself by choosing to listen. Their weapon is not force, it is desire. The promise we later learn from the song itself, of perfect knowledge. They claim to know everything that happened at Troy, everything happening across the whole earth, and they offer that knowledge freely to anyone willing to simply come closer and listen. Consider what that temptation is actually aimed at. Not hunger, as the Lotus had been, not comfort, as Circe's island nearly became, something closer to Odysseus's own deepest and most particular weakness, the same hunger for knowledge and recognition that made him linger at Polyphemus's cave to see what manner of creature lived there, the same pride that made him shout his name across open water rather than sail away anonymous but safe, The sirens do not tempt every man the same way. They tempt each listener with exactly what he most wants to know. For a man defined, above almost anything else, by curiosity and the desire to be remembered, this may be the single most dangerous trap in the entire voyage. More dangerous, in its way, than any monster with teeth, because it asks for nothing but the choice to keep listening. Circe gave Odysseus a specific plan, and it is worth noticing how this plan differs from every solution he has devised on his own so far. Every previous trick, the wine and the false name, the men bound beneath the rams, was Odysseus's own invention, born in the moment, improvised under pressure. This one is handed to him whole, in advance, by someone who already understands the danger better than he does. Sometimes, this detail quietly suggests wisdom is not inventing a clever escape under pressure, but simply being willing to accept good advice before the danger arrives at all. He instructed his men to plug their own ears with wax, kneaded soft in the sun, so that they would hear nothing of the song at all. Odysseus himself, though, would not plug his ears. He wanted, characteristically, to hear the sirens' song and survive it, to know what generations of doomed sailors before him had died desperate to hear. So instead, he had his men bind him tightly to the ship's mast, hand and foot, with strict instructions that no matter what he said or begged or ordered once the song began, they were to tighten his bonds further rather than loosen them and row on without slowing. It is worth sitting with what this plan actually asks of Odysseus. Every other trial in this voyage has tested his cleverness against an external danger. This one asks him to design, in advance, a trap for his own future self, to distrust correctly the judgment he knows he will have once the temptation actually arrives. That is a genuinely rare kind of wisdom, not simply resisting temptation in the moment, but recognizing beforehand that his in-the-moment self cannot be trusted, and building a structure sturdy enough to survive his own persuasion. The plan worked exactly as designed, and the scene that follows is worth picturing carefully because of how much restraint the story shows in describing it. As the ship drew close enough for the song to reach them, the wind dropped to nothing, as though the sea itself wanted the men to hear clearly. The crew, ears sealed with wax, rowed on in total silence, unable to hear anything at all, not the song, and crucially, not their captain's voice either. Odysseus alone heard the sirens singing, and the tradition tells us, briefly and without dwelling on the specific words at excessive length, that they called to him by name, praised his fame from the war at Troy, promised him knowledge of everything that had happened and would happen across the whole world if only he would come closer. He strained against the ropes with everything he had and begged his men, with his eyes and with whatever sounds he could still make, to release him. They did not. Two of them, Perimedes and Eurylochus, the tradition names them specifically, rose from their benches and tightened his bonds, further instead, exactly as instructed, and rowed on until the island and its song had faded entirely behind them. Notice what has just happened and how quietly the story lets it pass. This is arguably the only moment in the entire voyage where Odysseus's own men do exactly what he asked of them, precisely, under pressure, even against his own desperate protests in the moment. And it is also, not coincidentally, one of the only moments where nothing at all goes wrong. Compare this to the bag of winds, opened against instruction out of suspicion, Compare it to what will happen soon on Thrinacia, where instruction will again be ignored, this time with fatal consequences. The lesson sitting quietly beneath this episode is not subtle, but it is earned. Obedience born of trust, this once, saves everyone. It will not always be so easy, and the story is about to show us, in the very next stretch of water, exactly how costly the alternative can be. The danger did not end with the sirens. Circe had warned Odysseus of one more trial waiting immediately beyond them, and this one offered no clever trick at all. Only a choice between two certain losses. The strait ahead was narrow, flanked on either side by two monstrous dangers, positioned close enough together that no ship could avoid both. On one side, high in a cave in a sheer cliff face, lived Scylla. Once, in some versions of her story, a woman transformed by jealousy and old magic into something with 6 long necks, 6 heads each ringed with 3 rows of teeth, and 12 legs dangling beneath her, forever fixed in her cave, forever reaching down to snatch sailors from any ship that passed too close. Directly opposite her, on the other side of the strait, lived Charybdis, not a creature with a face or a name to bargain with, but a whirlpool, a churning mouth of water that swallowed the entire sea 3 times a day and spat it back out again, capable of pulling an entire ship down into its depths, whole. Circe was explicit, and it is worth repeating exactly how explicit, because of what it reveals about the nature of this particular trial. There was no way to defeat either monster. There was no clever trick, no bargain, no gift of wine or false name that would work here. There was only a choice about which loss to accept. She told Odysseus plainly to sail closer to Scylla's side of the strait, rather than risk Charybdis, because Scylla, monstrous as she was, would only ever take exactly 6 men, 1 for each of her heads, while Charybdis, if the ship strayed too near her, would take the entire vessel and every man aboard it at once. Better, in other words, to sail close enough to guarantee a small, specific loss than to risk everything on the chance of losing nothing at all. This is worth sitting with as one of the most quietly brutal moments of decision-making in the entire poem, because of what it asks of a leader, and because of what Odysseus chooses to do and not do with the knowledge Circe gave him. Circe had told him plainly that fighting Scylla was pointless, that arming himself and standing ready to strike at her would accomplish nothing except delaying the ship long enough for her to snatch even more men than the 6 she was fated to take. And yet, when the moment came, Odysseus put on his armor anyway, took up 2 spears, and stood at the bow, prepared to fight a monster he had been told, explicitly, could not be fought. What he did not do, notably, was tell his men what was coming. This deserves to be named plainly, because it is a genuinely difficult choice to sit in judgment of. Circe had told Odysseus that if his men knew 6 of them were fated to die, no matter what anyone did, they would panic, stop rowing, huddle together in terror, and possibly doom the entire ship to Charybdis instead by losing control of the vessel at the exact wrong moment. So, Odysseus kept the warning to himself and steered them deliberately toward the side of the strait where he knew, with certainty, that some of his men would die. Consider what this costs him and what it reveals about the kind of leadership this voyage has been quietly building toward since Aeolus's Bag of Winds. Back then, secrecy, Odysseus, refusing to explain the bag's contents to his own crew, helped destroy 11 ships worth of men. Because his silence bred suspicion that curdled into disaster. Here, secrecy is chosen again, but this time deliberately, strategically, and, the story suggests, correctly, sparing the crew a terror that would have cost them more than it saved. It is not a comfortable parallel. The same tactic that failed catastrophically once succeeds grimly here. Perhaps this is simply what leadership under impossible constraints looks like. There is no formula guaranteed to work every time, only judgment, applied as well as a flawed and exhausted man can manage, with real lives weighed against real information every time. As the ship threaded the strait, staying close to Scylla's cliff exactly as instructed, 6 long necks shot down from the cave above and seized 6 men from the deck at once. The tradition specifies that Odysseus heard them cry out his name as they were lifted, still alive, into the air, calling to him for help. He had already been told by a goddess who could not lie about this, was impossible to give. He watched it happen. That is the detail the story insists on, and it is worth sitting with, rather than softening. Odysseus did not look away. He watched 6 of his men, calling his name, carried up into Scylla's cave to be devoured. The single most agonizing sight, he says himself in the tradition, of everything he witnessed in all his years of wandering the sea. Worse, in the telling, than anything even Troy had shown him. And then the ship was through, into open water beyond the strait, with Charybdis's roar fading behind them, and Scylla's cliff shrinking into the distance, carrying a crew smaller by 6 men, and a captain who would carry the sound of his own name, called out in terror by dying friends he could not save. For the rest of the journey, they had survived, narrowly, at exactly the cost Circe had promised, and not 1 man more. Ahead of them now, though none of them yet fully understood how soon it was coming, lay the island Tiresias had warned of most urgently of all. Thrinacia, the sacred pasture land of the sun god's cattle, the one danger in this entire voyage that came with the clearest warning anyone had yet received, and, as we are about to see, the one danger that would prove impossible for exhausted, starving men to resist, no matter how clearly the cost had been explained to them in advance. There is a particular kind of tragedy that arrives not through ignorance, but in spite of full knowledge, where every warning has already been given, clearly, repeatedly, by more than one voice, and disaster happens anyway. This is that kind of tragedy, and it is worth saying plainly, before it unfolds, that nothing about what happens on Thrinacia will come as a surprise to anyone who has been listening carefully to this story so far. Tiresias warned of it directly in the underworld. Circe warned of it again in even more specific terms before the ship ever left her island. By the time Thrinacia's shore comes into view, Odysseus's men have been told, at least twice, in the plainest possible language, exactly what will happen if they touch the cattle grazing there, and exactly what it will cost them. They will do it anyway. And it is worth asking, honestly, why? Because the answer says something true about hunger, exhaustion, and the limits of what warning alone can actually prevent. As the ship approached the island, Odysseus, remembering both prophecies, tried to convince his men to sail past it entirely, avoiding the temptation altogether, rather than trusting anyone's willpower, including his own, to resist it once they had landed. Eurylochus objected, and it is worth taking his objection seriously, rather than simply reading it as one more instance of crew disobedience, because there is real, sympathetic weight to what he says. The men were exhausted, he argued, worn through by grief, by the horror of watching 6 companions torn from the deck at Scylla's cliff only recently, battered by a voyage that had offered almost no genuine rest since Circe's island. Sailing on through the night, without landing, without proper food or sleep, risked a different kind of disaster. Storms that could scatter or sink them in darkness, exhaustion that could make every man on board less capable of surviving whatever came next. Better, he argued, to land, eat a proper meal, sleep through the night, and depart safely at dawn. It is worth pausing on how reasonable this sounds, because that is precisely what makes it dangerous. This is not Eurylochus arguing, as he sometimes has before, out of simple mistrust or fear. This is a genuinely sound piece of practical judgment, and Odysseus, outvoted by exhausted, hungry men who had every ordinary reason to want solid ground beneath them for one night, agreed to land, but only after extracting a solemn oath from every man aboard that none of them would touch the cattle grazing on the island, that they would eat only the provisions Circe had given them for the voyage and nothing else. Notice the shape of this decision. It is not recklessness, it is caution, compromise, a reasonable leader, listening to reasonable objections, and building in what safeguard he can, and it will not be enough. They landed, ate the last of the food Circe had provided, and settled in for what they expected would be a single night's rest before departing at dawn. The wind did not cooperate. A month passed, not a single night, not even a single week, but a full month, trapped on that island by a relentless south wind that made departure impossible, blowing so consistently and so strongly that no captain in that world would have dared risk open water against it. This is worth sitting with, because it removes, almost entirely, the element of simple impatience or poor judgment from what follows. This was not a crew growing restless after a day or two. This was a crew slowly starving, watching their supplies run out entirely, day by day, with no end to the wind in sight and no way off the island until it changed. Odysseus, to his credit, held the line as long as anyone could reasonably ask. He hunted and fished with his men, sharing what little could be caught, stretching dwindling supplies as far as they would go. But a month is a long time to survive on an island surrounded by fat, healthy, untouchable cattle, watching your own men grow gaunt and desperate, while food that could end their hunger in an afternoon grazes peacefully within easy reach every single day. One afternoon, while Odysseus withdrew alone to pray to the gods for a change in the wind, and, notably, fell asleep during that prayer, exhausted himself, at exactly the wrong moment, Eurylochus gathered the remaining men and made an argument that is worth hearing in full, because of how genuinely persuasive it is, and how completely it inverts everything the 2 prophecies had warned against. Better, he argued, to die quickly at sea from Helios's anger, if it came to that, than to starve slowly and helplessly on this island while surrounded by food they were forbidden to touch. And besides, he offered a specific plan meant to soften the transgression. They could sacrifice a portion of the cattle to the gods themselves, promising to build a temple to Helios upon reaching Ithaca in recompense, hoping that ritual and future restitution might blunt whatever anger the theft provoked. It is worth pausing on how carefully reasoned this argument is, because it is not the same kind of impulsive curiosity that opened the bag of winds, or the reckless disobedience that nearly cost lives at the Cyclops' cave. This is calculated desperation, dressed in the language of piety and negotiated risk. Men convincing themselves, with real logic, that a warned against catastrophe might somehow be managed or mitigated if approached carefully enough. It did not work, and the story does not pretend that the sacrificial ritual they performed made any difference at all. They killed the cattle, cooked the meat, and ate. And the tradition includes one small, unsettling detail worth noting here. Even as they roasted the meat, the hides of the slaughtered cattle were said to crawl along the ground of their own accord, and the meat on the spits let out sounds like the lowing of living cattle, as though the sacrilege itself refused to be disguised as an ordinary meal. When Odysseus woke and returned to find what had happened, there was nothing left to do. The cattle were already dead, already being eaten. No warning delivered now could undo it. Helios's response, when it came, was not delayed or ambiguous. The sun god went directly to Zeus and demanded justice, threatening, in a detail that reveals just how seriously this transgression was taken even among the gods themselves. To take his light down to the underworld and shine there instead, refusing to illuminate the world of the living at all. If these men were not punished for what they had done, Zeus agreed to destroy them. The wind that had trapped them for a month finally changed, and they set sail at last from Thrinacia's shore, believing perhaps that they had escaped consequence after all, that a month's delay and one desperate meal might be the whole of the cost. It was not. Days into open water, a sudden storm struck without warning, snapping the mast, which fell and crushed the helmsman where he sat, and Zeus, the tradition tells us directly, struck the ship itself with a thunderbolt, splitting it entirely apart and hurling every man aboard into the sea. Every man except one. This is the moment the story has been building toward since Act 7, since the harbor of the Laestrygonians reduced 12 ships to 1. Now that single remaining ship is gone too, and with it every companion who had sailed from Troy alongside Odysseus, men who had survived the Ciconies, the Lotus, the Cyclops' cave, the bag of winds, the massacre in the harbor, a year on Circe's island, the edge of the underworld, the siren's song, and Scylla's cliff, all of them finally lost here on this last island to a warning they had been given twice and broken anyway, out of hunger too complete to resist any longer. Odysseus survived only by lashing the broken mast to the ship's keel with a length of rope salvaged from the wreckage, using it as a makeshift raft, and clinging to it through the storm that had killed everyone else who had sailed with him. Worse was still to come before he found even that much safety. The current carried him back toward the strait between Scylla and Charybdis. The very danger he had barely survived once already, now facing it again with no ship, no crew, no weapons, nothing but a broken mast to cling to. This time, it was Charybdis' mouth that opened beneath him, threatening to swallow the wreckage, and Odysseus with it. He saved himself only by leaping up and clinging, with his bare hands, to the branches of a fig tree growing from the cliff above the whirlpool's edge, holding on, suspended, until Charybdis finally spat the mast back out below him, and he dropped down onto it and paddled away, exhausted beyond anything he had yet endured, alone on the open sea. It is worth pausing here, at the lowest point this voyage has yet reached, to take stock of exactly what has been lost. Odysseus left Troy with 12 ships and several hundred men. He now has nothing. No ship, no crew, no cargo, no weapons beyond what he carries on his own body, drifting on a length of broken wood across open water, with no land in sight. Every companion who set out with him from that smoking beach at the beginning of this story is dead. The prophecy Tiresias gave back in the underworld has now come entirely, precisely true. Odysseus will indeed reach home eventually, but late and alone, having lost everyone who sailed with him, exactly as the prophet foretold and exactly as Circe warned a second time, before they ever set foot on Thrinacia's shore. There is something worth sitting with in how completely this transgression's cost falls on men other than the one who might, in some versions of leadership, be blamed most directly. Odysseus did not eat the cattle. He tried to prevent it, extracted an oath against it, and was asleep, exhausted and praying. At the exact moment his men broke that oath, out of a hunger he could not fully solve for them, and yet it is his voyage that pays the price in full. Every companion lost, while he alone survives to carry the consequence forward, alone, into whatever comes next, drifting now on nothing more than a broken mast, carried by currents he cannot control toward a destination he cannot see. Odysseus was, at last, entirely by himself. No crew left to disobey him, no companions left to mourn. Nothing ahead but open water, and whatever the sea decided to do with what remained of him. What it decided, after 9 more days adrift, was to carry him toward a small, remote island, and toward a very different kind of danger than any he had faced so far. Not violence this time, not hunger, not monsters, but the quiet, endless, seductive stillness of a life with nothing left to strive for at all. For 9 days, Odysseus drifted on nothing more than a broken length of mast, carried by currents he could not direct, past the point where hunger and thirst and exhaustion should reasonably have killed him. On the 10th day, the sea brought him to the shore of a small, wooded island called Ogygia, and there, alone, without a ship, without a single companion, left alive to share in whatever came next, he was found by a goddess named Calypso. It is worth pausing on the name before the story goes any further, because it is not incidental. In the Greek, this story comes from Calypso's name is bound up with the verb kalyptan, to conceal, to hide, to cover over. Everything about what follows will bear that meaning out. This is not simply an island. It is a kind of concealment, a place where a man can be hidden so completely from the world he left behind that, for a time, it is almost as though he never existed at all. Calypso took Odysseus in, fed him, sheltered him, and, this is worth stating plainly, because the tradition does not soften it, kept him not as a prisoner in chains, not through violence or threat, but through something that functioned, in practice, just as effectively: isolation, desire, and the simple, grinding absence of any other option. She wanted him as a husband, offered him her bed, her company, her island's endless, undemanding comfort, and this is the detail that makes her offer so much more dangerous than anything Circe or the Lotus had presented. She offered him immortality itself, never aging, never dying, an eternity spent exactly as he was, on an island where nothing needed to change ever again. Consider what this temptation actually is and how precisely it has been built to test everything this voyage has already shown us about Odysseus. The Lotus offered forgetting, but only to men without the will to resist a flower's honeyed pull. Circe offered a year of rest, but released him the moment he asked to leave. Calypso offers something categorically different. Not a pause in the journey, but an end to the entire premise of it. Why struggle toward a mortal home, growing older, uncertain, dangerous, when a goddess offers a life that never has to end at all, on a shore where the sea that has tried to kill him 12 times over can no longer reach him? For 7 years, Odysseus stayed. It is worth sitting with that number, because it is not a detour of weeks or months, the way the Lotus or even Circe's island had been. 7 years is longer than the entire war at Troy. It is the largest single block of time in this entire 10-year voyage, and for most of it, the tradition tells us Calypso's company was, in its way, genuinely comfortable. Song, food, an immortal lover in a paradise untouched by storm or monster or grief. And yet, when we finally meet Odysseus directly in this story, not through report, not through prophecy, but seeing him with our own eyes for the first time since the ship broke apart beneath him, this is where we find him, and it is worth noticing exactly how the poem chooses to show him to us, not thriving, not seduced into contentment, sitting on the shore, the tradition says, weeping, staring out across the sea toward a home he had no way to reach, his eyes never dry, spending his days doing nothing but longing for the one thing this entire paradise could not give him, the ability to leave it. This is worth pausing on, because it is the clearest possible answer this story offers to a question it has been quietly asking since Achilles told Odysseus in the underworld that he would rather live as the poorest servant above the earth than rule as a king among the dead. Here, finally, is Odysseus facing something close to the inverse of that choice. Not a short, glorious life against a long-forgotten one, but an eternal, comfortable, undying life against a short, uncertain, mortal one, full of danger and grief, and a wife who might, for all he knows after 7 years of silence, have long since given him up as dead, and even offered eternity itself. Some part of him keeps returning, every single day, to that shore, aching for the lesser thing, a home that will age and change and someday end, but that is genuinely, irreplaceably his. Perhaps this is the clearest measure the story gives us of what home actually means in this narrative. Not comfort, not safety, not even happiness in any simple sense, but something closer to the difference between a life that is merely pleasant and a life that is truly, specifically one's own. It was into this 7th year of quiet grief that Hermes arrived, carrying the instruction Zeus had issued back at the Council of the Gods in Act 3. The decision made, deliberately, while Poseidon was away and unable to object. Calypso received the god's message with an anger that is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. She argued, and her argument carries real weight even now, that the male gods resented any goddess who took a mortal lover for herself, pointing to other instances in the tradition where similar relationships had been violently ended by jealous divine intervention. There is something genuinely uncomfortable, and the story does not entirely paper over it, in how casually the male gods of this world dispose of a goddess's 7-year devotion the moment it becomes narratively inconvenient. Calypso is not written as a simple villain here. She is written as someone who loved, in her own way, honestly, and is now being ordered to let that love go by a council of gods who never had to justify their own decision to her at all. She obeyed anyway, because in this world, even goddesses obey Zeus. She went to find Odysseus on the shore where he sat, as always, weeping toward the sea, and told him he was free to go. There is a scene here worth pausing on carefully because of what it reveals, plainly and without ornament, about what Odysseus actually wants. Once the choice is finally laid bare in front of him, rather than simply imagined, Calypso, before helping him build a raft, made him a genuine, direct offer one final time: stay and be immortal and never age and never die. She was not lying about the offer, and the tradition does not suggest Odysseus doubted her ability to grant it. He refused. His answer, as the tradition records it, is measured and careful, rather than dramatic. He acknowledges, plainly, that Penelope cannot compare to Calypso in beauty or stature, that any mortal woman set beside an immortal goddess would come up short by every visible measure. And then he says, in essence, that none of that changes what he wants. He wants to go home. He wants to see his wife again, whatever the years may have done to either of them. Whatever dangers still wait for him there, he is willing to suffer greatly, he says, to make it happen, and has suffered greatly already, and will keep suffering if that is what it costs. Penelope's knees went weak, the tradition tells us, and she wept. Finally, completely, 20 years of careful, guarded uncertainty breaking all at once, and ran to him and embraced him and explained, through her tears, exactly why she had needed to be so cautious for so long, that she had lived in genuine fear all these years of exactly this kind of deception, of some clever stranger arriving to claim a kingdom and a wife under false pretenses, and that only this test, resting on a secret no deception could reach, could have finally, safely, let her believe Odysseus did not resent the caution once he understood it fully. If anything, the tradition suggests he recognized in it something close to a mirror of himself, the same instinct that had made him suspicious of Athena's own good news back on the shore of Ithaca in Act 14, refusing to celebrate a homecoming until he had verified it was genuinely safe to do so. Two people, each shaped by 20 years of loss and deception into the same hard-won carefulness, finally recognizing that same quality in each other as proof, at last, that neither of them had been broken by everything the years had cost. They held each other for a long while in that hall, husband and wife, 20 years, and an ocean of monsters and grief between the young couple who had parted at the start of a war and the two people who now stood, older, changed, scarred in ways visible and invisible both, finally, fully, home. There is more story than this. The poem does not end quite here. Word of the suitors' deaths spread through Ithaca, and the families of the slain men, furious and grieving, rose up briefly in an attempt at revenge, a final, small conflict that threatened to unravel the peace so newly won. It took Athena's direct intervention and a firm word from Zeus himself to finally settle that last unrest and impose a lasting peace on the island. A reminder, even at the very end, that homecoming in this story was never simply a private matter between husband and wife, but always, also, a question of kingdom, community, and the fragile work of rebuilding trust among people who had lost sons, brothers, and neighbors in that final afternoon of violence. Odysseus was reunited, too, with his aged father, Laertes, living in quiet retirement on a modest farm outside the city, having withdrawn from the hall entirely during the long occupation unable to bear watching strangers consume his son's inheritance. That reunion, quieter than the one with Penelope, but no less significant, closed one of the story's oldest threads. A father who had waited 20 years without ever losing hope, finally seeing that hope repaid. And somewhere ahead of this story, beyond where we leave it, waited the last piece of Tiresias's prophecy from the underworld. The ore carried inland, planted as an offering to make final peace with Poseidon himself. That journey belongs to another day, another telling. For tonight, our story ends here, in Ithaca, at peace. The hall was quiet now, where 100 men had once feasted loudly on another man's cattle, drunk his wine, and courted his wife. There was only the low, settling sound of a house at rest, servants sweeping the last of the ash from a hearth banked low for the night, the heavy doors closed and barred not against danger any longer, but simply out of habit, out of the ordinary comfort of an ordinary evening. Penelope's loom stood in the corner of the hall, still, its threads no longer being woven by day and quietly unpicked by night. There was no more need for that particular patience now. It had done its work, bought exactly as many years as it needed to, and could rest, unused, gathering dust in the corner of a room that no longer required its slow, secret magic. Outside, the sea that had taken so much, 12 ships, and every man who had sailed on them, and 10 years that could never be returned, moved against the rocky shore of Ithaca the way it always had, the way it always would, indifferent now to the man who had once fought so hard against it. It was, tonight, simply the sea, not an enemy, not a road home, just water, moving quietly in the dark, the way water does. Upstairs, in a chamber built around a living olive tree that no one else could ever have known to look for, two people who had spent 20 years apart lay finally, simply, together, not as a king and a queen with a kingdom to manage, not as strategist and steward holding a fragile piece together through careful, separate cunning, but as a husband and a wife, tired, older than the two young people who had once been parted by a war neither of them had wanted, and entirely, quietly, home. If you have been listening this long into the night, perhaps you are somewhere warm yourself now. The lights low, the day's noise finally settling the way the noise in that hall once settled. The arguments, the striving, the long uncertain waiting, all of it quieting now into something closer to rest. There is no monster left to outwit tonight, no storm gathering on the horizon, no bow to string, no test still waiting to be passed, only the quiet, ordinary miracle of having arrived, finally, somewhere safe, the way Odysseus did, after everything, after all those years of storms and strange islands and men who did not come home. The lamps in that hall, one by one, were going out. Let yours go out too. Now, if you're ready, the story is finished. The sea is still, and somewhere, in a house grown quiet at last, an old king is simply, finally, asleep.